Hello and welcome to this very special edition of Newspeak. It's very much the day after the night before, obviously being the election. I'm delighted that we have with us a stalwart friend of the channel, historian David Starkey. Thank you very much for joining us, David. As well, of course, as usual, Amy Gallagher of Stand Up to Woke, and making a rare and really welcome repeat visit, Emma Webb, who is an associate, obviously, of the New Culture Forum, and actually we're seeing you a lot on GB News now, aren't we?
I'm
Definitely.
happy to be back.
Yeah,
NCF.
so it's good to see you, Emma.
Spreading herself thin.
Definitely over the last
we hope
24
not.
hours.
Just before we talk about the election and all the issues therein, we have an event coming up, a locals event, next Wednesday on the 10th of July. It's in Beaconsfield, and it's with Eric Kaufman, Dr. Eric Kaufman. He's going to be talking about his new book called Taboo. Should be a great evening. They always are with the locals these days. If you'd like to go, if you're in Beaconsfield or around there, you want to come, it's in the evening, starts at 7, it's entirely free. Best thing to do is to write to locals@newcultureforum.org.uk. So that's next Wednesday, the 10th of July at 7 p.m. Well, look, first things first, before we actually talk about what happened, I just thought it might be good to refresh our minds with actually the numbers. Okay, so what we have, and this is we're recording this in the afternoon, so basically it might slightly change, but probably not.
You're going to make us cry, Peter.
Yes, we have obviously a turnout for this election of 59.6, which is about the lowest in 20 years, first thing. Labour on 411, Conservative on 121, Lib Dems on 71, SNP on 9, that's something to talk about, and Reform on 4. I think that by the time you watch this, it might have gone up to 5. But anyway, you get the general gist. I'll start with you, if I may, actually, Emma. What's your biggest, I know it's a terrible phrase, but what's your biggest takeaway of this election?
Well, you mentioned the turnout being historically low, and I think it's very interesting that the Labour's vote share is historically low. I think it's actually less than 2017. It's less than the vote share under Corbyn, and yet they've also got this whopping great majority. So this isn't a 1997 style moment. They actually don't have the mandate of the British public. Even the Lib Dems got less of a vote share than the Reform Party, despite the fact Reform have got 4, maybe 5 seats, and the Lib Dems have got 60 plus. So I think actually what this result shows is not, as Keir Starmer said in his victory speech, that this shows that they have got the mandate of the British public. Yeah. What it actually suggests, I think, is what we've all been talking about for years and years and years now, when we've been the effective opposition as small c Conservatives to a very unconservative Conservative government, which is that there is a profound malaise. People didn't come out to vote, and Labour won by default, because really this is a story of the failure of the Conservative Party, not the victory of Keir Starmer. So for me, that is the main takeaway, combined with the fact that actually, and I know you mentioned the SNP, and I'm sure we'll come to it later, but that actually we've got a number of independent candidates. Even though George Gallagher lost his seat in Rochdale, that's gone to Labour. We've seen a number of independent MPs who have won on the, quote, to use George Galloway's phrase, the Muslim vote. They've won on the Gaza ticket, and I would include in that to a degree Jeremy Corbyn, though I think that's a bit more complicated. So I think what we're seeing here is a profound shift in our politics that may be the result of the fact that after 2019, COVID somewhat frustrated what would have been the great realignment in our politics.
It's fair to say we are people of, broadly conservative viewpoint, whatever. How do you feel, Amy, about it this morning?
I think it's not as bad as I thought it might be for the Conservatives. I should say I did predict on the show that they would get 120 seats, which yes, I did, and it looks like that.
We should give you a little round of applause, really.
Yeah.
Did you go down to Paddy Power?
Did you bet on it? Did you bet on it?
No, and I
what a
should have
shame!
done.
What a shame! Would have been legal.
But I think many people were, the lowest predictions for the Conservative Party were like 60 seats, between 60 and 80 seats, and I think if they had got that, I think many people were thinking this was the absolute demise of the Conservative Party, that it would have been the death of the Conservative Party. And I don't think that has happened. I don't think this is a seismic shift in kind of the two-party politics of Labour and Tory.
Well, isn't it just proof that a two-party system both rewards the two parties, quite simply? A first-past-the-post system essentially assumes two parties. And the Conservative Party has been protected in exactly the same way that the Labour vote has been grossly exaggerated in terms of the numbers of seats. Can we actually get the arithmetic right? We heard about just under 60% of the population vote. The legally entitled to population vote. Of those, almost exactly a third vote Labour, right? That means, if you do the broader arithmetic, which my generation is able to do in its head, that means only 1 in 5 of the electorate voted for Labour. They are going to do all of this on the basis of 20%. And one of the things we need to move on to is the kind of rhetoric that they will use to justify that. So the language of them, and there's another really interesting point we should be making. Labour's mandate is a purely constitutional mandate. That's to say, it is produced by the peculiarities of our constitutional system and first past the post. So do you know what Starmer represents in electoral terms? He's exactly like Donald Trump. And Trump, again, loses the plurality of the vote when he was president, but wins the electoral college. We can see the House of Commons works now like an electoral college, amplifying the power of certain, usually very small constituencies. So all of these things need to be built in as an indication of, as it were, in terms of the numbers of seats, where real affiliation lies. I don't believe it for a second. It's the result of a peculiar series, the Lib Dems, the absurdity of a party led by this buffoon whose entire career is contaminated by his role in the post office scandal. But there are clearly huge shifts going on. The first Emma mentioned, which is that since Blair, since 1997, electoral participation has fallen off a cliff. And this is the most important thing. Since the Electoral Reform Acts at the end of the First World War and the full participation of women in the electorate, from that point up to 1997, you were looking at turnouts in the high 70s, 80s, and I think pushing at some points nearly to 90%. It then just falls straight off a cliff after 1997 to, is it 2001-2, whenever the second Blair government is elected. It drops at that point to where it is now. It drops to under 60, and then it nudges up a little bit like that, and then it drops back down again. So what we're seeing is this enormous, this is the big takeaway, the plague on all your houses, the love list, the love list landslide, the majorities, all these things that people have been coming up with. And this is profoundly dangerous. And one of the things that we as Conservatives are going to have to do, including everybody around this table, we need a new programme of public education. A programme, again, because the centre of the Blair message is basically that the popular vote is just varnish. It's just something you stick on top. The government properly belongs to the technocracy. And again, in other words, exactly like the European Union. Bizarrely, our national elections, now think about this, our national elections are now going the same way as our European elections used to go. It's a very, very similar phenomenon and a product of the same thing, the belief in the rule of the expert.
But sorry, I was just going to say, but obviously, the Reform Party, but Labour, probably to extent, even though it's favoured them, will be making an argument for proportional representation. But arguably from a constitutionally conservative perspective, I presume that we would argue not in favour of proportional representation. So I guess the question is then, what do you do aside from having a programme of public education?
Well, I mean, I'm pretty pro PR actually.
Excuse you. We will excuse you. I mean, you're a very unclear conservative, it has to be said. You're all over the place in your conservatism. But
I think the crucial thing, we are talking about we're mixing up two things. On the one hand, you've got the whole PR question, and then the other hand, we've got basically the fact that people aren't voting like they used to, with one huge exception, actually, David, and that is the Brexit vote. I mean, I know it wasn't a general election, but it was the...
It energised people.
It was the highest vote.
That's right, which again should lead us to ask another set of questions. The Brexit vote was regarded as an extreme vote. In other words, this was something that stepped outside this framework of centrist politics. What is quite clear is the sort of centrist politics that's pushed by the Times, which now Starmer claims he's doing, which the Emma Duncans and the Daniel Finkelsteins and the Matthew Parrises of this name advocate, leads directly to political disengagement.
Yes.
In other words, the idea that all elections are won in the middle depends on the assumption people don't greatly care. And there's this tiny little needle that moves in the middle, primarily driven by economic criteria. And this seems to me to... The one good thing that I hope emerges from this election is this does not work. You can pay as much money as you want to an Isaac Levido, you will still get a rubbish result. In other words, we've got to rethink. We've got to do what Margaret Thatcher did. Thatcher did not win from the centre. Attlee did not win from the centre.
And yet now what they're talking about is having Jeremy Hunt as the leader of the the Conservatives, because that will solve the problem.
That will really end the party. That would absolutely.
Can I actually just... This is instructive. I don't know from which point of view, but anyway, if we had... Someone's worked out, if we had proportional representation in this particular election, right, these are what we would have had. Labour would have had 219, Conservatives 154, Reform 93, Lib Dem 79, Greens 44, and SNP 16. So you see, to someone, I voted Reform. And also, when I was very heavily involved in the Brexit campaign, but also for UKIP before that, we got 1 MP, 4 million votes. This time we've got 4 MPs for Reform. But I remember at the time there was no question in my mind we needed PR, because you see that 93 there, and you sort of think, well, that's it. But then if you add them up, it's still basically a left-wing alliance you've got.
You end up with a situation like the Netherlands or somewhere on the continent.
Yes, you have the Lib Dems, you have Labour, and you have the Greens, which are bigger than Conservatives and Reform put together, unfortunately. Even though Conservatives and Reform put together are bigger than Labour, the coalition of all the left-wing would be bigger than the small c Conservative vote.
But can we just talk about what actually happened rather than the fantasy of proportional representation? Proportional representation is a total fantasy at the moment. Is Labour really going to alter it? Are they going to commit electoral suicide by doing it? No, they are not. So I think that, and again, what we should be focusing on, surely, are the takeaways now, which makes our government sound like a bad pizza, which it very, very strongly, which it very, very strongly represents. Shall we look at
too many takeaways are going to make you ill.
Really, I think, bearing in mind the fatuous following of American behaviour by changed Labour, whatever we're supposed to call it, it's a really bad American hot. It is American lukewarm that is our government. Can we look now at the thing that's most interested me, which is bearing in mind this extraordinary result of 2/3 of the seat on 1/5, the vote of 1/5 of the electorate. What language is Starmer now using? Here is this man who's been famously tongue-tied. He's suddenly been gifted in tongues. Can I remind you of what we've been hearing from him this morning?
Is this morning as his speech?
Right. The first speech to the Labour faithful. This is a man that everybody has been saying is not religious. Right? But of course he is religious. He's the man who says he would rather let his children die than use the NHS. Now, if that's not a religious belief, I don't know what it is. So here we are. This is the language of the new religion. Walk into the morning, the sunlight of hope, pale at first, but getting stronger in the day, shining once again over our country with the opportunity after 14 years to get its future back. Do you know what this is? This is an instruction to AI to write a riff on Wordsworth. This is bliss it was in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heavy. This, I think I've now cracked Starmer. Starmer is actually a bot.
An AI. Yes.
Starmer quite clearly is a bot.
He looks like one.
He talks like a bot. He looks like a bot. He doesn't think like a bot. He is a bot. So so we've now got the question of what is Starmer a front for? Because bots are operated And we now need to find out what Starmer is a front for. And very conveniently, he told us in that extraordinary speech from Downing Street. Did we all watch it?
Mm-hmm.
No.
You should have done. Yeah. What is the language? The language is of service, of national service. Now, whom does that remind you of?
The Queen.
Well, the Queen.
The Queen.
Yeah.
Starmer spoke like the new monarch of a new national monarchy. It was completely extraordinary. And what does it mean? Well, I think, again, one of the things we need to identify is what Starmer has been... He's been talking about two things in this election. He's been talking about these mysterious working people, which are some form of transmogrification of the old working class. But mostly he's been talking about the public service. And he's been constantly saying, I was a public servant. I am devoted to public service duties. Now, what does this actually mean? Well, what it really means is, and this is, I think, the big takeaway, the lukewarm American hot pizza of the election. The Labour Party has completely transformed. This is the final transformation which began under Tony Blair. The Labour Party is now not the party of the working class, not the party of working people, whoever they may be. It is the party of the new ruling class. It's the party of the blob. And can we investigate this wonderful thing called the public service? The public service is, in fact, a group of privileged, overeducated people that gives themselves special rights. Do you actually know the pension arrangements of Sir Keir Starmer, KC, let's get this right, he's a Knight of the Michael and the George, isn't he? KCMG. Do you know what his pension arrangements are? They were so vast that they required a special Act of Parliament. There is a special Act of Parliament for the protection of Sir Keir Starmer, QC, ex-Director of Public Prosecutions. I mean, it is beyond belief. These people arrogate to themselves early retirement. They arrogate to themselves inflated pensions, entirely unfunded. And this is what the Labour Party represents. And this is my hope, that when the Labour Party, when this new change Labour fail, it will be not just the failure of the Labour Party, it will be the failure, the visible, inescapable, unavoidable failure of the whole blob. And that's what we as Conservatives should be pushing. The Conservative Party is the new popular party. That's the only takeaway that makes any sense you can come from.
But Deb, when you say the Conservative Party is the new popular party, I mean, it won't, it seems to me, learn any lessons. If it had gone below 100, it might have done, right, I would say. Okay. But it's basically on 121.
Let me then just produce a reply to that, and then I'll shut up for the moment, because what I'm saying is, if the Conservative Party is to have a future, that is what it will have to become.
Oh, yes.
It has once again to become the party that dares to believe in actual democracy, that dares to believe in parliamentary democracy, that recognises that the sovereignty of Parliament isn't some mysterious thing that descends from heaven. It is a product of the fact that a Parliament properly voted in represents everybody. And its binding authority comes from that. And until we rediscover that fact, and I would argue until the Labour Party rediscovers it, we are lost. We're going straight down the road to some kind of technocratic quasi-dictatorship.
I also think if it's going to be a party of the future, it's going to have to take reform seriously.
Yes, it will have to incorporate a large part.
But when you say take reform seriously, what do you mean? To be more specific?
Well, I think the leader going forward will have to be on friendly terms with reform so that they can do some kind of pact with them. Either they or they just assume all of their positions, but I think that's unlikely. But they'll have to work alongside them, and we know. I mean, Kemi Badenoch still has a seat. Suella Braverman still has a seat. I suspect Suella's going to be everyone the person that's most likely to be able to work with them, because
the defeat isn't big enough.
Yes, exactly.
And Reform's number of MPs isn't large enough that there's an incentive to defect, and I think that's a problem. But I just wanted to pick up quickly on something that David said, because In Starmer's, and I thought this was very interesting, Starmer used the term, or to describe this government, by saying that they would be unburdened by doctrine. And going back to picking up on what you were saying about this sort of, and I also thought the same thing, that he's choosing to identify himself with the late Queen, which is an unusual move. And I think that the really insidious aspect of that, because obviously he describes himself as a socialist, he must presumably mean something by that, although he has shown, has almost explicitly said he's willing to say almost anything to get elected. But he then, in the same speech, goes on to use the same language of respect that he used when talking about gender and Rosie Duffield. He started his speech with identity politics by mentioning that Rishi Sunak comes from a minority background. So what I thought was so interesting in terms of this allying himself with this language of service and public service is that what he's trying to do is to further depoliticize the highly ideological stance that his party will take in a way that makes it effectively, I think this is what he's positioning himself to do, is to make it effectively unchallengeable, because he knows that he has this enormous majority with no real mandate, and if the silver lining could be that if he's too brazen and has too much hubris in wielding that majority, that it will make the weariness, the disenfranchisement so viscerally obvious that come the next general election, maybe reform can sweep in and take a whole load
or a Conservative Reform Alliance. But I would just like to sort of elaborate slightly what Emma said there. I mean, it seems to me that what we're really seeing is beneath all this language of service, there is Keir Starmer, public prosecutor, or as he prefers to call himself, chillingly, chief prosecutor.
Yes,
Chief of Police.
It's terrifying. Behind Keir Starmer, there is Sue Gray. What was Sue Gray? She was the enforcer of the Cabinet Office. Do you know the Cabinet Office keeps Stasi files on individuals? It receives private denunciations which are not disclosed to individuals. She, as head of propriety and ethics, was in charge of that. And who is the third person that they're inviting into it? You know it is Ollie Robbins. Ollie Robbins was famous or infamous as Theresa May's Brexit negotiator. He is really a part of the security state. He has spent the last few years in an outfit called Hackloyd, a Mayfair consultancy. And do you know, Peter, whom Hackloyd consists of?
No.
Former MI6 spies.
Really?
I mean, it's inconceivable. Now, the point that I'm trying to make is that the only way in which this minority creed, the woke creed that you're against, the critical race theory that we're all against, the absurdities of transsexualism, whatever, the only way it can be enforced on a population that doesn't believe in it, 4 out of 5 people do not believe in it, is by the law. And what we're going to see is increasing aggressive use of the law to suppress freedom of speech, to suppress freedom of assembly, and also to lie. It's entirely based on a fiction. This language of service, this language of consensualism is a lie. What we're actually seeing is precisely that I highlighted all this bizarre language. This is a version of what George Orwell talks about in his essay on language. This is the newspeak. This is the newspeak of changed labour. It is a language which is wholly absurd.
And I think that's why it's so the rhetorical identification with public service sounds all fluffy. You know, it sounds almost small c conservative. It's so sinister because it is a way of. I said depoliticizing, but it's in a way it almost sort of, it's like a kind of form of political necrosis.
I think what's so terrifying about Starmer is I don't think he believes that he's ideological. I think he believes his positions are just correct. You know, you see it, and all
It's
of these...
because he's religious.
Yeah,
So
yes.
this is the implication of a religious view of politics. That of course you believe what you believe, but of course because it comes from some higher authority, in his case belief in universal human rights and whatever, there can't be any debate with it, because if it's religiously true, to oppose it isn't simply wrong, it's wicked.
See, the problem is with this, is you, in terms of fighting back, as it were, and you talk about needing obviously a strong Conservative Party or whatever, and I might want reform or whatever it is, all of these things you're talking about are kind of rather hidden. That's the problem.
Why we need education?
Yes, I know.
Why I bother to appear on funny programs like this?
Yes. No. Yes, it's quite.
No. I
so
mean,
this is the reason for it.
Why the New Culture Forum exists. And look,
Yeah.
so if that's not the purpose of the New Culture Forum, why bother with it?
I think we need to lead the constitutional elephant back into the room,
That's
because
my view.
the public service point also touches on it, and the one way in which it might compare to 1997 is that it could have serious, irreversible constitutional implications.
That is the intention. If you read, there's a second manifesto that wasn't actually fully published, which is the Commission for Constitutional Change that was chaired by Gordon Brown. And in that, there is a clear mission, and again, it's very interesting, Emma, you put your finger on it precisely. It is the argument that left-wing positions are mysteriously the respectable majority opinion. And the idea, there are pseudo-public opinion surveys, for example, on the NHS. And the conclusion of this is, because the NHS commands broad public support, the idea of free healthcare, free at the point of use, should be written into the Constitution. And the idea, because most people subscribe apparently to the idea that we should welcome immigrants, that from the moment you're in the country legally, you are fully entitled to all welfare, should be written into the Constitution. And in order to do, this is where your point about constitutional change comes in. The coping stone on all of this would be a new Bill of Rights, which would incorporate these rights to, not freedoms from, as it were, rights to have free healthcare, rights to have welfare, and all the rest of it. And you would then alter the role of the House of Lords into a constitutional long stop chamber that would certify any act of the House of Commons as being unconstitutional and refer it to the Supreme Court. In other words, if there is ever to be another Conservative government put together on whatever basis, it will have to have a simple programme of gigantic constitutional repeal. All the changes, the Supreme Court, the incorporation of the European Convention, above all the Equality Act, they will all have to be repealed, exactly as Margaret Thatcher did.
It is along the pattern of the European Union, in the sense that what they're rigging things by effectively creating institutions that function as the demos. So the actual electorate doesn't really have any, and we've been seeing this because it's the legacy of Tony Blair. We've been seeing this play out throughout the Conservative government that struggled to, and I don't think they tried hard enough, but they still would have struggled to reverse some of those constitutional changes, things like the Supreme Court, because what they do is they bake certain progressive values into the system in a way which is unconstitutional, so that, for example...
It's new constitutional. In other words, what they do is they pervert the Constitution.
Well, it's parallel. So you have the Supreme Court rather than having Parliament as the highest court of the land. And so my point is that I think that, for me, I actually think all of this stuff about identity politics, the stuff that we normally talk about, it is insignificant in comparison to the constitutional damage that they can do.
Shouldn't you cite D. Starkey with respect at this point, as I have been pushing this idea as hard as possible? This is the central idea. The perversion of the Constitution actually allows woke. Woke is not a separate phenomenon. It depends on its legal support. And there's another terrifying thing, Emma, which we need to look at carefully, the role of the civil service. The civil service has been deliberately What a term, civil service. I am your humble servant. What tosh. The civil service has been deliberately taken over by the Labour Party. The role of Sue Gray, the role of Ollie Robbins is just the tip of the iceberg. Senior civil servant after civil servant has been given vast bursaries by the Tony Blair Institute, and they've effectively undergone programmes of indoctrination. And do you know what the intention is? That the civil service will become exactly like the EU Commission. It will be the real centre of government. And what is written, if you actually read the Labour manifesto, you will see there will be legislated a new obligation that all incoming ministers have to test policy against the civil service for doability. In other words, you will only be able to do things that the civil service says you can do. Now, in other words, this reverses the legislative pattern, which is exactly the same in the European Union. All European legislation derives from the Commission. So what there has to be, and you see, I don't think it's impossible, Peter. We have been here before. We were here exactly in 1974. The fall of the Heath government triggered exactly the kind of self-scrutiny in the Conservative Party that we're hoping takes place. This is the moment at which Keith Joseph wakens up and realises he had not been a Conservative. He'd called himself a Conservative. He'd served in a Conservative government, but he wasn't Conservative and the government wasn't. And he founds your neighbour. He founds the Centre for Policy Studies. And you're fortunate at that point. You find a figure, primarily Friedrich Hayek, who supplies the arguments, and you then find a politician, Margaret Thatcher, who has got the strength of will and the strength of intelligence to force them through, and the political wiliness, and is able to get the majorities necessary, and has the courage to do it. And in other words, I think that what's been done before can be done again, but it will be very difficult. You will have to have a Conservative government that has a genuine manifesto that says, we will undo these things before we... And also, wouldn't it be just thinking of reform, why don't we think of the idea of a negative platform? I think everybody in reform, and increasingly the majority of what's left of the Tory party, could agree on that great repeal bill. In other words...
But is it not a problem if in terms of the authority and legitimacy of the Constitution, if its starting point ceases to be the 17th century and becomes 2020 something? If you repeal
it is absolutely. But I think, again, the language I'm using, we've been here before. All the characterizations of Starmer are the Puritan. He's a nasty personal Puritan. That curl of the lip, that the proper definition of a Puritan. Somewhere somebody is enjoying themselves. A lad is having a fag. Somebody's having a bit of sugar. That instinctive desire to stop it, to ban. That's so characteristic of Starmer. Well, we had a Puritan revolution in the 17th century with a rather more effective Starmer called Oliver Cromwell. And we still had, the nation had the good sense to reverse it. The English are the only people to have reversed a revolution without foreign intervention. It's a very remarkable thing.
We need a new glorious revolution.
We could do it again.
I think, yes, I totally accept what you're saying. But in terms of practicalities, I can't see this Tory party as it stands now in the Commons even thinking along these lines, David. They don't even understand. I know that that's the reason people like us exist, to educate, but you are talking about the Tory party. I would have thought that what they will do is when they for example, finally get round to getting a new leader elected or something, it will be someone who is basically going to appeal to the blob.
Yeah. Even now they don't get it, I don't think.
Yes, the people they're putting forward.
Maybe there will be an internal coup. I mean, the Tory party is ripe for picking. It is going to be very short of money.
Well, thank God Kemi kept her seat.
The one thing that effectively drives Conservative politics is money. And the money is going to... The easy money, which it's relied on, is all trotted off along with Lord Harris of Carpets to change Labour. There is going to be a very different kind of money available, which may demand different things.
Can I just turn to something which is rather like 1974? Well, no, it's not. It wasn't there in 1974, not in this way. But what this election as well has kind of revealed, something we always thought of anyway, is just quite how embedded now a kind of sectarianism is.
Can we call about it religious? Can we stop calling it sectarian?
Oh yeah, no, it's fine.
It's religion as a dominant force for an important section of the electorate.
Right.
I've got the list here actually of the constituencies that have got it's not all of them, I don't think, but Blackburn, the new constituency of Dewsbury and Batley, surprise, surprise, Birmingham, Perry Barn, Leicester South, and if you include in that Jeremy Corbyn's constituency in Islington. I mean I think this is a historical.
You need to just 1 second. We need to add another.
Yeah.
You need to add Leicester South, where the Tories won precisely because of the intervention of the Islamic vote,
and also that Jess Phillips, and I think very significant, Jess Phillips and Wes Treating only just managed to scrape by, partly because that vote took such a bite out, and the fact that Ian Duncan Smith won in his Essex seat because Faiza Shaheen split the vote with the Labour Party, and it's the only reason why he won.
Also, as we were saying before we came on, Starmer himself. You know, he's
huge
loss.
Yes.
Right down by whatever it was.
Less than 20,000.
But the point is, to me, this is, you know, you're talking about the same amount of MPs as Reform. And to me, this will be the great unreported story. I think going through the campaign it was, and I think it will remain that way. I think it will just get lost.
We're talking about the sectarian element.
Well, yes, the religious...
But it's unmentionable.
Yes.
I mean, in terms of the new religion, we are not supposed to talk about these things in the same way we're not supposed to talk about the takeover of the streets of London by a howling mob. We're not supposed to talk about the passivity of the police in front of it, because it's against the new religion. But I think it is worth thinking of what the British people are now going to be seeing. They're, of course, going to be seeing a Europe where this kind of thing is increasingly respectable. They're going to be seeing a Europe which actually starts to try to do something about this. A Europe which doesn't simply say, if you come into the country, you can bring your entire extended family and clan.
I thought it was very interesting to see Jess Phillips giving her victory speech when she was being booed and howled at by I don't know if you've seen the video of the Gaza activists, and she actually
group of men.
And she quite robustly sort of staked her position on the stage and continued with her speech. But I think Labour are really going to have to reckon with the fact that even in those, there are now, and I'm pretty sure this is quite unprecedented as well, that you have all of these independent MPs that are standing on a very, very distinctive ticket, despite the fact that they're not the same party, but that within certain Labour constituencies, those MPs are going to have to reckon with the political consequences of the sectarianism of those who do not respect the normal way of going about the democratic process. They won't simply respectfully listen whilst the elected MP gives their speech.
But they'll go along with it. They won't resist it. They will go along with it.
This is the really interesting question, isn't it? How will the Labour Party respond?
They'll go along with it.
The likelihood is, let's be truthful, they will actually legislate Islamophobia being a crime.
Well, that's the other point I was going to mention.
That's exactly what they will do.
And then they'll never win in Batley again.
Never, ever win in Batley again. And the other thing that I think, but you see, there's an exactly analogous thing with the whole business of trans rights. And what I think we will see is Labour will equivocate on this, but that equally is going to have very powerful electoral consequences. If they come down on the side, to be blunt, of and turn themselves into a branch of the Islamic Party, what is left of their working class support will go.
And I think that's
why in other words, the electoral put it simply, at this election, the electoral coalition of conservatism collapsed. We're seeing now all the seeds that will destroy the electoral coalition of Labour.
The thing is, because they've got such a large majority, they don't have to worry about the fact that essentially 5 Labour MPs have lost their seats to these independent sectarian independents. But you know, if the Labour Party or Reform do come back in the next election, they are going to have to reckon with this, because it's only going to get bigger. I mean, the demographics are such that there will only be a rise of these independent
and
candidates.
the Labour MP for Rochdale is now going to have a job on his hand after unseating George Gallagher.
We're going to have a voting block in Parliament of Islamism.
Wouldn't you say that possibly by the time, 2029, the next one is, that there might even be an official party?
But David mentioned the Islamophobia definition, and I think again, when I heard Keir Starmer's language of respect in his speech, obviously the mind immediately goes to trans, because he quite recently has used the same framing in relation to the situation with Rosie Duffield. But of course, the language of respect is also the language that has been used around the Islamophobia definition. So when, again, going back to what I said before, that when he talks about being unburdened by doctrine, I think it is newspeak, it's doublespeak. He means the opposite.
Because, again, we've got to get this point again of language and what something like the New Culture Forum, what Eric Kaufman is trying to do at Buckingham, what I'm increasingly trying to do. What we're trying to do is to break this code. We're trying to point out that the equality legislation is all about creating inequality before the law. And Labour is going to do this in spades with the new Race Relations Act, which is effectively going to prioritise in every respect anybody with a skin. It's monstrous. It's been correctly described by Kemi Badenoch as a new apartheid. It's going to it is going to give people with a coloured different skin pigmentation. Suddenly, the basis of your legal rights are not going to be equality before the law. They're going to be the amount of whatever it was, it's melatonin, isn't it? The amount of melatonin in your skin. This is monstrous. But we've got to say, so in other words, equality legislation is inequality. There's only one form of equality that matters, which is formal equality before the law. Human rights have been perverted. They are now the rights of minorities against the majority, which demand government intervention. Similarly, we're now told that we're told repeatedly, democracy is about protecting the rights of minorities.
Well, this is
in other words,
Marcusian.
the number of people who vote for Labour. Very clearly.
This is also true of the gender issue, in that they want to ban so-called conversion therapy, which is essentially banning any therapist that challenges a person's belief that they are born in the wrong body.
Isn't
so
it
it's
also not just therapists, it's like family members?
So that you can't challenge a person's trans identity, essentially.
And especially, arguably, as they say, transing the gay away, that is a form of conversion therapy.
Yes, exactly. It's the opposite. Like David was saying, it's complete opposite of what it's claiming to be.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
So it is literally newspeak, but it's also a world in which the truth is untruth. That we are losing any notion of objective reality.
Well, it's Marcusian. Everything is actually its opposite.
Everything is its opposite. And it is Alice in Wonderland. It's a world through the looking glass.
I do sort of feel, I felt that actually during the campaign, and I watched the election till about 3:00 this morning, and you sort of feel slightly that you're in an alternate reality. In the sense that none of the important things are actually ever really broached. None of them, ever. I mean, I know Nigel Farage said that this would be the immigration election, but actually, unless I missed something, it wasn't really, was it?
No. Only for Nigel. Nigel was talking in his own echo chamber. In fact, what was very striking, if you looked at the campaign, all three campaigns were, 4 campaigns were completely different. They were talking about different things. The Tories were in their own box. The Liberal Party was, in the madhouse, or the swimming pool, or whatever it was. The Greens they had their own issues. There was no congruence.
Well, for most people, it was the why bloody bother election.
And it was a why bloody
why
bother
go out?
Election, yeah.
Why bother going to the polling
station? A plague
station?
on all your houses.
That was noticeable because, in fact, I can't remember an election where there were so few placards or, in people's windows.
Not in Jeremy Corbyn's constituency.
Nobody. I received no canvassing at all.
Yes,
where did you see it?
Unfortunately, I did, from the Workers' Party.
Yes. Can I? One thing we haven't talked about briefly, and that is what's happened with the SNP. Some people would say, this is a good thing that's come out of it, that the union is basically now pretty safe, at least for whatever.
No, it's not, because of Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer has explicitly endorsed the idea that we're 4 nations, written into the not one, that written into the manifesto is a pledge to reinforce devolution at exactly the moment it's died, at exactly the moment that it is perfectly clear in Wales and Scotland that devolution produces rubbish governments headed by people who are both corrupt and stupid. And in Scotland, we can now actually see that Macbeth was not a play. It was a documentary. When you look at the behaviour of Sturgeon and Salmon, it is exactly like a scene out of Macbeth. There are these, or the McGregors versus the Campbells. There are these inexplicable.
You could definitely write an opera about this election.
So the logical conclusion of what you're saying, David, is that actually the SNP therefore is not really needed anymore. You
should abandon devolution. But of course, remember, the real governing, we've talked a lot about Starmer, and we've talked a lot about Blair. The really key figure in Change Labour, and it's terrifying, is Gordon Brown. This is Gordon Brown's programme for the fragmentation of the United Kingdom. He is the one who drove through the constitutional changes of the new Labour government. He is the one who chaired the commission which proposes the much more radical constitutional changes. And the person, interestingly enough, one politician, tweeted in support of the bright sunlight of Starmer. It was Gordon Brown this morning.
Interesting.
Can you imagine Gordon Brown as a little ray of sunshine? This great, brooding, psychologically disturbed.
Never mind the SNP. You need nothing outside of the party.
Yes,
the party is everything.
But would you say that, like, oh well, that's it now for the SNP, but basically that's a good thing? I mean, despite it actually now being enshrined as 4 nations and all of this?
Well, I think Labour, one share of the vote that did go up for Labour was in Scotland. I mean, that's where they did really well, because they took the votes from the SNP. Yeah. But, as David was saying, a lot of these ideas that Labour have align with the SNP anyway. So
in a way, it becomes more... I'm obviously glad to see the back of the SNP. It would be great if they ceased to exist, but at the same time, going back to where we started in this conversation, there is an aspect to this that is more insidious because it's less out in the open.
Yeah. I think, in fact, just 1 second, we've got an exact model. In the 1990s, the British Army and Intelligence defeated the IRA. Tony Blair handed a victory to the IRA with the Good Friday Peace Agreement. And that's exactly what's going to happen. If you reinforce the devolution settlement, which is... Haven't you read the Labour manifesto? It is absolutely specified that there's going to be a new duty of congruence between the 4 governments. The British Prime Minister is going to have... There's going to be a separate Council of the Nations. In other words, you are going to institutionalise the... And again, it's the right. There's no accident about either. There's no accident about Salmon and Sturgeon. There is no accident about the idiot Drake. You've only got to look at Drake in Wales to realise he was a fool. This kind of shambling, ludicrous. A good 19th century phrenologist would have recognised him for exactly what he was. But there's no accident that these kind of figures appear in the sort of constitutional settlement Emma has so eloquently described. And I think there's something else that we need to understand. We're going to get them all throughout England. There is again a determination to multiply the number of directly elected mayors. And I find this whole thing profoundly terrifying.
I think this also relates to the problem of PR, because I think it's part of a programme of abstraction and rationalisation that is beneath the surface of Labour's entire ideology, and it's directly antithetical to the particularistic way in which our political institutions have developed, and therefore will destroy them.
And do you know what the other Labour model is? And again, we've not talked about it. There was another great ghost in this election campaign. It was COVID. The real background, everything that happened, were the knock-on consequences of COVID, furlough, and all the rest of it. But if you read, again, which you clearly haven't have done and you should have done, the Labour Party manifesto, it loves COVID. It begins with a paean to the behaviour of the British people during COVID, those mysterious working people that wouldn't let each other down. There's this entire paragraph given to Sir Patrick Vallance, you know, one of the three wise men of the apocalypse, to confuse a few metaphors, that was responsible for SAGE. His endorsement is sought for New Labour's radical approach to global warming. And at the end, the role of the invention of the various vaccines, with the committee chaired by Kate Bingham, is invoked as the model of New Labour's industrial policy.
Well, now that's the other elephant in the room, is net zero, which hasn't actually been spoken about very much at all.
No, well, when you say it's the other one, I mean, the fact is the room is full of elephants, actually. I'm not being frivolous, but immigration legal immigration is not discussed. No one really knows what they intend to do.
We've heard Yvette Cooper on immigration.
Yes, with COVID, it is interesting, but it's a general thing. It's interesting it wasn't talked about, but at the same time, you can understand why neither Tory nor Labour would want to talk about it. They're pretty much shamefaced, I would have thought, about it.
No, they're not. No, Starmer boasts. So this is the thing that's terrifying. Sunak apologises. Starmer boasts. Remember, this is why COVID offered us the ghost of this terrible world that we're moving into. Because the Tories were reluctant. Boris Johnson hated doing what he did. Starmer, the BBC, the collective media were clamouring for more. The willful connivance of so many of the British people, the idiots beating their saucepans, the whole collection of curtain twitchers, the snitchers, the mask wearers, all they're the Puritans.
Actually, but Dave, also I think what's crucial about it with the COVID thing, without wishing to digress too much, is that it was sort of, I felt, it was like a celebration of vulnerability. It was
that's another thing, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, yes, but in a way, so much of what Labour is now
totally
is
woke
about
is that.
victimhood and weakness, a distrust of
power,
strength,
of any form of power.
Starmer even managed to victimise Rishi Sunak at the very beginning of his speech by mentioning his background, when Rishi Sunak made no point of mentioning how difficult it might be for someone from
My father's a tool maker. My father was a tool maker too. It has to be said, I think, that Keir Starmer's father triumphed. He certainly made a tool.
He is the tool maker.
The tool.
I don't know if any of you...
The divine artificer. But you see, again, this underscores another point about Starmer's allegedly not having a religion. Woke is a perverted form of Christianity. It's a perverted form of Puritanism. I mean, I know it's not very Puritan to cite the Magnificat, but the whole message of a kind of Nietzschean parody of Christianity is the worship of victimhood. You know, Nietzsche's a very accurate description, in my view, of Christianity as a religion for slaves. Listen to the opening of the Magnificat. He shall put down the mighty from their seats and exalt them of low degree. That's the message.
Well, actually, I mean, this is taking us off on a slight tangent, but I do think it's important in understanding, like you're saying, he's coming from a sort of religious perspective, that there is an almost sort of Lutheran, maybe in some sense, and it's a point that Tom Holland has made, which is that this kind of subjective turn that Protestantism brought into the Western imagination, all of the stuff around victimhood, the identity politics, and ultimately the erosion of authority, because everything is just dependent on the self.
Yes, but also...
But the irony of that is that Starmer and Labour will get so much authority through that subjectivism.
But it's all power rather than
power.
authority.
Also a kind of a love of the mediocre. I mean, it just
you
goes through...
Like a Davy.
You mean Keir Starmer's self-love? Yes.
Well,
Can we remind ourselves of his A-levels? 2 B's and a C when he was a scholarship boy at a selective school. Right. Now, that is simply a disgrace. This man is a pure plodder. I wanted to start calling him Sir Keir Plodder. And he's a plodder because he's the equivalent of a cross-country runner, you know, these absolutely dreary people.
How did he become a KC with grades like that?
Because he specialised in a branch of law where you don't have to appeal to a jury.
How appropriate.
No, it is an extraordinarily interesting fact. All his cases were before judges. It's within this narrow little clique in which you essentially argue on paper. But the thing about Starmer is that he's really a policeman. The thing he boasts, this constant boast about what I did as Director of Public Prosecutions, we're giving ourselves a dilute police state. That's what it is.
I think when you look at it, when Parliament assembles, the new Parliament assembles, it's obviously going to look very different. And you sort of think, well, what are the first problems going to be, on if you like, on a day-to-day basis? I wouldn't be surprised if certain conventions really start to get tested. So, for example, face covering. That must come up at some point, surely. You know?
And also, do you know what? They will move over onto the opposition benches as well, because there won't be enough seats for them.
Yeah. Well, if you have such a supermajority, then the opposition ends up being within your own party.
That's right. In other words, exactly your process, that somehow, and again, we're very likely to see, because of the restoration of the refurbishment of the Houses of Parliament, the Palace of Westminster, we're likely to see a temporary chamber. What is the bet that it will be a horseshoe?
It will be a set, exactly.
It will be a
Keir Starmer has explicitly said that he wants that because it's undermining the adversarial
then there's
geography
none
of Parliament.
This nasty thing like opposition. Nobody's rude to each other.
Just like European Union.
Actually, I'll go one further now. I think it will be a horseshoe. I think that the place for it is going to be on Whitehall. Is it Whitehall House? You know, one of the better.
It was
Richmond House.
No, I think that's been dropped.
Oh, has it?
I mean, that
was going to be there.
It was because it would have meant tearing the interior out.
Right. Well, it will be like a horseshoe. Do you know what? In some terrible symbolic way, I think it might well be that they never actually move back into Parliament.
They'll turn it into a museum of some kind.
That would certainly be a Starmer's wish.
Yes, and
because that's a building that echoes everything he hates.
Yes, exactly.
It's a building that incorporates the greatness of Britain, the proper tradition of parliamentary debate. I mean,
and it's also the physical form
debate.
of the Constitution.
Yes.
It is the Constitution
Yes,
incarnate.
exactly.
They can't inhabit it. If when he talks explicitly about wanting to reform the House of Commons, I think he means that physically. I think in an ideal world he would tear it all out and it would be a nowhere place, somewhere like Brussels.
Well, it would look like the Chamber of the Supreme Soviets, which, remember, was torn out of the Kremlin. And do you know what, and I think we should probably end on this note, do you know what the first thing Yeltsin did? He tore out the Chamber of the Supreme Soviets and rebuilt the Great Hall of the Nobility, the Hall of St. George, which is what you see Putin in.
Sir, comrade.
Well, as you heard it there, we're about to end, as David has said. So thank you very much, David. Thank you so much for that. And thank you very much, Amy and Emma. Come back a bit more often, won't you?
Invite me.
Yes, of course, it'd be great. But to be continued. Anyway, thank you very much indeed. Anyway, we shall see you next. Actually, no, not next week. No Newspeak next week, because quite a few of us are going to be going on a holiday. So basically, there won't be one. But there will the week after. Okay, thanks very much. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.